Hi, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the Lake Pend Oreille State of the Lake meeting. My name is Kara Campbell. I'm the Regional Communications Manager for the Panhandle region, and I will be your moderator for this evening. Here with us tonight is Chip Coursey, our Panhandle Regional Supervisor, Andy Ducks, Regional Fishery Manager, Matt Coursey, Principal Fishery Research Biologist, and Ken Bowens, Mitigation Staff Biologist. The goal of this event is to talk about the diverse fish stocks on Lake Pend Oreille and activities planned for 2021. You can ask us questions at any point tonight by using the form below your video feed. Please fill out the form completely and submit questions only related to tonight's event. A pre-recorded presentation was made available prior to tonight's meeting that provided detailed update regarding the fish stocks in Lake Pend Oreille. If you are unable to watch this presentation before the meeting, we highly encourage you to take time and watch it when you get a chance. Once again, if you do have questions during this meeting, use the form below your video feed. Your questions will come to us and then we will answer them during our question and answer session. At this point, I'm going to kick things over to Chip Coursey.
Thanks, Kara, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to what I believe is the 15th State of the Lake meeting. Unfortunately, we did not get to hold one last year due to the pandemic. The pandemic is still here, but we thought it was important to update all of you on what's going on in the Pend Oreille fishery, what's going on with our research and management programs, and the efforts that are going into that. And also it's an opportunity for us to hear from you, the anglers, and answer questions and get a sense for what you folks are seeing out on the lake and thinking about. The current management approach on Pend Oreille is one that we started on in the early 2000s. That's been reaffirmed through a lot of public opinion, to iterations of the state fishery management plan. It's a story that we're pleased to be talking with you about. There's a lot of good things going on. And I want to say we appreciate everybody's participation and willingness to engage. And with that, we'll kick it off. So thank you for participating.
All right, we're going to have everyone else just kind of introduce themselves here.
Just a quick introduction. I'm Andy Ducks, our Regional Fishery Manager. I've been the manager since 2015, and I've been working in the region on Pend Oreille since 2008.
Hi, my name is Matt Coursey. I'm the Principal Fishery Research Biologist on the Lake Pend Oreille project. I've been in that position since 2015. And prior to that, I was an anadromous biologist down in the Clearwater region.
Yeah, hi there. My name is Ken Bowens. I'm a mitigation staff biologist here at Idaho Fish and Game. I work with the Avista Clark Fork Settlement Agreement. I've been doing that for about 7 years now.
All right, so now we're going to dive into the questions. We had a lot of folks submit questions prior to the event, so we're going to start with those and then work our way through those as they come in tonight. Once again, if you do have questions, use the form below your video feed and we are going to start working through those. So our first question we have this evening is for Matt. Matt, the question is, if I want to target Lake Pend Oreille walleye from a boat, where should I be fishing? 3 years ago, I caught several northeast of City Beach, but I haven't found them again.
That's a good question. So I brought up a map here so that I have something I can reference as I talk about this. So this map came from our State of Lake presentation that was recorded online. And what this depicts is where fish were returned in the Walleye Angler Incentive Program. And this covers a pretty broad area, and I'll narrow in for you a little more. But suffice it to say that City Beach area is, that's where this 42% of all walleye, that's part of that. The City Beach is part of that northern LPO region. And in general, what I would suggest is focusing along the northern shoreline of the lake, and in the Clark Fork River and the Pend Oreille River. You know, in our FWIN, our fall walleye index netting operation that we carried out last fall, we certainly saw walleyes distributed all through both Odin Bay and then west towards Sandpoint. Historically, the Sunnyside area has been an important area for walleye as well, particularly spawning in the springtime. That is where we spent a lot of our time netting and removing fish. The other thing I would definitely want to mention to you is two or three other locations. So the Clark Fork Delta being one, that seems to be an area where anglers do reasonably well chasing walleye. And likewise up in the Clark Fork River, folks do reasonably well. And those are both areas that we don't have tools right now for removals with nets. And so one, it provides some of those fish. There are additional fish there that anglers can remove. And two, these fish move a lot. And that's one of the things we've learned over the last couple of years with our telemetry. And so they redistribute themselves quite a bit. We've got a lot of documentation of fish moving in and out of the Pend Oreille River and into the lake. So some areas in the Pend Oreille River that would be worth trying would be the Dover area and Dover Bridge. And then also we get a fair number of reports from down near Priest River, just upriver from the town of Priest River, especially along that southern shoreline. But in general, in that area, folks have done well on walleye, and we've sampled quite a few of them down there. So those would be several areas worth trying.
All right, thank you, Matt. Our next question is for Andy. Andy, why hasn't there been more information about the record bull trout taken from Pend Oreille earlier this year? I see new record on the IDFG website, but unlike past record-breaking fish, I can't find any additional information.
Okay, yeah, so if folks aren't aware, there was a new catch and release record bull trout, was caught in January of 2021. We have two record programs. One is our certified weight record program, and then our catch and release record program is a newer program we've just had in the last few years. So this particular fish was the new catch and release record. It was a 39-inch bull trout. The cool thing about that fish was there was also an unofficial weight taken on the boat, and that fish was reported to be a 31-pound bull trout, which is really impressive. The certified weight record is 32 pounds, and that's the current world record that came from Pend Oreille. So this fish was, you know, real close to being as large as that world record fish. As noted in the question, we have posted this on our website. The angler's name, the length of the fish is now officially entered. We did not get a news release out on this. We wanted to, but we didn't have a great photo to share of the angler with the fish. The only one we have is the fish up against the measuring board that was being used to verify its length. So because of that, we just didn't publicize this more, but there is a photo of it. You can see in the presentation, if you didn't already, under fishery performance, there's a picture of that bull trout that came off a Facebook post. So yeah, that's the answer to that one.
All right, thank you, Andy. I just want to take a moment. There were several comments that were submitted thanking our presenters about the excellent presentation and the information they provided. And so we definitely acknowledge that and appreciate hearing those comments from you folks. The next question or comment I'll also give to Andy here. More of a comment, but maybe you can address it for us. This comment says they're really sick of people handling rainbows in the river. They think a fourth of them are not making it. So we need to close it or go with not taking them out of the water, no bait in the Clark Fork River. Andy, could you address that for us?
I can, and this is a topic that's come up over the years, folks being concerned about the catch and release fishery that occurs in the Clark Fork River. We do have that under catch and release rules only from December 1st through the Friday before Memorial Day, recognizing that there's a seasonal migration of these large rainbows from the lake up into the river and tributaries to spawn. And so we have catch and release rules so that harvest is not allowed. And I just want to let folks know that we are monitoring that fishery very intensively. Our enforcement staff are out there on a regular basis. The nice thing about this fishery in the Clark Fork is it occurs in a small section of river. Most of the effort occurs near the mouth of Lightning Creek, so it makes it easy to, keep tabs on that fishery. Our officers are seeing really good compliance with our rules, not only in terms of folks releasing fish as they're required to do, but also folks are generally handling fish in a responsible manner. We're not seeing, anything that's particularly alarming in that regard. There's also a comment in this question about the use of bait. We do allow the use of bait in the Clark Fork River, but not in tributaries like Lightning Creek. One thing I can say from the patrols that have been done, and even from our staff being out on the river tagging fish and observing anglers in that fishery, is that very few anglers are actually using bait to target rainbows. They're being more effective with other techniques, and most of the bait use we actually see in the Clark Fork is for other species. And it's part of the reason that rule is allowed. We did not want to take away from other types of angling. Folks that may be up there fishing for walleye or other species still have the ability to use bait. So I just wanted to take a moment, even though that wasn't really a question, it was more of a comment, just to reassure folks that we are paying very close attention to that, and we are seeing good compliance with that. And in addition, that's been on the books for a lot of years now, and we've been continuing to see the trophy rainbow fishery improve. And so if we had major problems up there, we certainly would expect to see that manifest in the fishery, and that's not the case. And the final piece I'll add on that is that the research program is doing telemetry work, and we've already started to get a little bit of information, but as we move forward in coming years, we're going to have a lot better information to look at how fish move through the Clark Fork and through that fishery, and be able to look at survival rates and when they move in and move out, things like that. So bottom line, I think we're in really good shape with that catch and release fishery, and a lot of folks are enjoying it.
All right. Thank you, Andy. This next question is from Matt. Matt, I'm concerned that with no walleye suppression in the Clark Fork River, that the walleye would target juvenile rainbow for a food source as the rainbow migrate to the lake from the tributaries. What is your feeling for that in the future?
Yeah, I think that is a legitimate concern for us in general. The reason we have such a focus on walleye and managing fairly aggressively for walleye is that walleye tend to have a preference for soft rayed, fin rayed fishes, such as trout and some of the minnow species that we have. And certainly predation on rainbows, bull trout, cutthroat, those are all things we're concerned about, both as those fish emigrate out of the Clark Fork River, but also as they emigrate out of other tributaries as well, including Pack River and Trestle Creek and several other important tribs for those salmonid populations. What I will say on that is we do have a graduate study going right now at the University of Idaho, and that graduate student is focused on understanding walleye food habits and diet. And the things we're observing there, it's too early to share any of that really, but certainly we are seeing a high salmonid component, at least in the fish that we can identify. Now that graduate student still needs to take her samples when she completes her sampling back to the lab, and most of those stomach contents are pretty well digested by the time she gets her hands on them. So she's going to spend time in the lab identifying those species using bone structures and things like that. We may learn that there is some predation on rainbows already occurring. The one thing I would say on that is at the point the lake's at right now, there's there are a lot of kokanee out there, and that's by design. That helps the rest of the fishery chug along on all cylinders. And as a result, the walleye population, which is now at a lower density than it was in 2017, they've got a lot of food resources in the form of kokanee and other things. And so their stomachs are, finding a trout might be finding a needle in a haystack. But suffice it to say, if you have overlap in distribution of walleye and cutthroat and rainbow trout and bull trout, it's a certainty that walleye will eat those fish when those resources are available. So that is a concern. As far as suppression, we don't have any netting suppression or that type of manual removal going on in the Clark Fork River, but obviously the Angler Incentive Program does apply in the Clark Fork. And so we have our suppression efforts there at this point in time. Our telemetry program that Andy referenced a minute ago, a big part of that is going to be to understand the timing and distribution of walleye in the Clark Fork so that we can both share that information with anglers and potentially learn whether or not there are going to be any opportunities for other types of removals. But at this point, without an obvious choice there in terms of other removals, we're relying on anglers to get the work done there.
All right, thank you, Matt. Our next question here is for Andy. Andy, in the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Minnesota, one can find walleye on food menus. With LPO walleye being tossed on the banks by Fish and Game, why can't they be harvested for restaurants?
Well, for starters, we don't throw fish on the banks. I'm not sure where this person heard that, but the banks we are distributing to are the food banks in the community. And so when we have walleye through the suppression program come on board the boat, those fish are distributed to food banks in the local community. And we feel like that is a very good use of those fish. It gets them back out in the community, makes that fish flesh available for consumption, and is a pretty efficient way for us to operate as well. Trying to figure out how to work with restaurants and other things would be very complicated. And the food bank system has been something we've done all the way back to 2006 when we started the lake trout suppression program. So yeah, all the fish that we bring in our suppression programs that are not released alive go to food banks, and that's been a really effective program with strong community support.
All right, thank you, Andy. This next question is from Matt. Matt, I wonder if it's possible to set more bounties on the predator fish and rely less on the netting. Maybe use those funds used for netting, not surveys, and give it to the public to target pike, walleye, and lake trout. Also, how much is spent for netting and bounty funds?
Yeah, so I'll bring up a slide here to kind of illustrate some points as I talk about that. So ultimately, the answer to your question about why we can't only rely on anglers comes down to the fishing power of anglers alone. And so I'll reference you back to this graph here that shows the trends in lake trout removal since the beginning of the lake trout suppression program. And the black portion of these bars here, you can see that declines as the population declines, but the angling portion, which is that black portion, declines more rapidly than the total removals do. And what we've learned is that in some ways, as suppression has been effective, it's harder to get anglers interested, regardless of what the bounties are, because there are fewer fish to catch. And ultimately, regardless of what those bounties are and whether there's bounties or not, one of the things we've learned through our studies of population dynamics on these fish, both starting with lake trout and now we're in the process of learning about walleye, is that you have to have kind of the two-pronged approach of both suppression and angling to maximize your opportunity for success. The numbers of removals we have right now for lake trout would definitely not be sufficient to keep that population at a level that is in balance with the prey base in the lake and sustainable over the long term, particularly with the suite of other predators that are in the system. And so the other part of this question was about how much we spend on these programs. And so the incentive programs at this point in time are paying out roughly $40,000 a year to anglers for lake trout. And so far, we've only had the walleye program going for a couple of years, but about $13,500 a year directly to anglers for walleye. By contrast, the amount of netting effort we put out for lake trout and walleye, it is more expensive. We put about $50,000 a year into netting, paying for the netting for walleye, and about $450,000 a year to pay for netting for lake trout. But in terms of the return to the fishery, having a balanced fishery where we are able to provide opportunities for these wide suite of fish and provide that outstanding trophy class opportunity for several of those, the value of the fishery far outweighs that. And so that the return on investment is very good. So that hopefully that answers your question. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that we need both sources of suppression in order to be effective.
All right. Thank you, Matt. So our next question will actually come back to you, so don't go away too quick. How is the walleye fishing on Lake Pend Oreille? What areas should you fish? I would love to help with walleye suppression. My problem is lack of information on where they are biting and on what. It would be nice if there was fishing information website somewhere, but I haven't been able to find one.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, the walleye fishery on Lake Pend Oreille is a new fishery. And I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna lie to anybody. It's a challenging fishery. Walleye are a challenging critter to catch regardless of where you're fishing for them. And, our management program for walleye right now is designed to keep walleye at a low density before they become a problem for the fishery. So walleye fishing can be tough, but it can be seasonally very good. And it's like any other kind of fishing. You're going to have really good days and tough days. As far as where to go, again, I would refer folks back to the Clark Fork Delta area, fishing right in the Clark Fork River. The Pend Oreille River, we actually have seen densities go up in the Pend Oreille River while they've gone down throughout the rest of the lake, at least in the fall. Fish do seem to, well, they're moving a lot in the fall, but it seems like the Pend Oreille River in the fall is a good place to be fishing. So yeah, I think I mentioned Odin Bay and Kootenai Bay earlier. Those are good places to be looking for fish. Around the long bridges, folks are catching them there. But it's a technical fishery and it's a challenging fishery. So, I think I would just recommend folks stay at it. And, there's good rewards if you catch them.
All right, thank you, Matt. This next question will be for Andy. Andy, with all the invasive species present, shouldn't it be best to leave them alone and allow sport fisheries to evolve? Spending money to control the various non-native species doesn't seem effective after years of trying. I suggest more to be done to enhance current species present. Leave things alone. The state of the lake suffers more when you meddle.
Sure. Well, this is something that we hear from time to time, and it's the reason that I spent a fair bit of time in the presentation talking about our management philosophy, basically, and especially with trying to manage for a sustainable fishery. And in order to manage for a sustainable fishery, there are certain species that are not compatible with that. So we've got most of the species in the lake. I referenced the 13 species that were caught in our last creel survey, and that most of those can coexist in the system and allow us to meet our management goals. But there are three in particular, lake trout, walleye, and northern pike, that are incompatible with that and threaten that sustainability. And so our mission really has two important components to it that folks should recognize. One of those is we're trying to manage for recreational fisheries that are sustainable over the long term. And the other piece of that is that we're also trying to conserve native species, and we're obligated to do that. And so in a system like Pend Oreille, where we now are challenged by having a lot of non-native species present, we have to really look at each of those carefully and how they interact in the system. And many of those species we can manage for. I mean, we've had a long history with species like kokanee and rainbow trout, obviously, but we've had other species come on the scene more recently, and smallmouth bass are a good example of that. We initially, when smallmouth bass got established, had concerns about whether they would be disruptive to the system and cause problems. And over time, we've learned that not just in Lake Pend Oreille, but in other water bodies, smallmouth bass, although they can have some impacts, they generally are pretty compatible with managing for abundant kokanee populations and sustaining some of the native fish that we're dealing with in this system. And so now we've got a comfort level that we don't need to be managing against smallmouth bass in this system. But we don't have that same comfort level with species like, certainly not with lake trout. We've already seen that lake trout just about collapsed the kokanee population when they started to increase in abundance. And that's the reason we've had that long-standing suppression program. If we didn't do that for lake trout, I don't think anglers would like the fishery that they'd have out there. We would have a fishery that's dominated by lake trout. Kokanee likely would be either completely gone by now or they'd be at a very low level. Without kokanee in the system, the rainbow fishery would just be, a shadow of what it is right now, with very few fish that would probably get bigger than 5 or 10 pounds, and likely even some lower densities of fish potentially. And we've seen this play out in other water bodies. Priest Lake is a good example where lake trout were left to just kind of run their course. And we now have a fishery up there where kokanee are at a very low level. Other examples like Flathead Lake, kokanee are completely gone because lake trout were allowed to just, proceed without any kind of intervention and just do their thing. So I guess trying to say here that in a lake like this, even though netting is typically something we view as a last resort in fisheries management because it's resource intensive and certainly it causes conflict with anglers, I think Pend Oreille has become a very good example of how you can use netting to improve a fishery and increase the performance of a fishery, especially in the presence of a bunch of these non-natives. And so, unfortunately, we can't have it all and just let all of these species do their thing. I would love it if fisheries management was that easy. The reality is it just isn't. And I think, the fact that we've recovered the fishery from where it was in the early 2000s and also been able to provide opportunity for some additional species along the way, even some of these species that we are managing against, like lake trout, walleye, and northern pike, those fish are still out there. They're going to be at a low density, but they're still there. So there is some opportunity, and some of the fish that are out there are reaching large sizes and provide some great trophy opportunities. So it's not like this is going to be completely non-existent. We just can't allow it to just, go unchecked, or we would see some very major changes to this fishery that would not meet the needs of anglers, at least the majority of anglers, nearly as well as what we're doing right now.
All right, thank you, Andy. This next question is for Matt. Matt, are there planned efforts for walleye suppression in the Clark Fork River above and below Cabinet Gorge? Over the past several years, there appears to be noticeable increase in the migration into the Clark Fork below Cabinet Gorge in the fall, which is likely having an adverse effect on the West Slope cutthroats and rainbow population?
Yeah, that's a good observation on walleye in the Clark Fork in the fall. We've definitely observed that in our telemetry studies. And the folks who are tuned into the Clark Fork walleye fishery certainly think about fall as prime time up there. As far as suppression activities that are planned there, right now it's angling and it's below Cabinet Gorge. There's a little bit of Cabinet Gorge Reservoir above the dam that's in Idaho, but not a whole lot. And that and suppression, mechanical removal, is something that is going to be challenging and going to require a little more understanding of where fish are when to go forth in the Clark Fork. So it's not something that we're not there yet. I did want to circle back since we're talking about the suppression tool we do have there being angling. I wanted to circle back on that previous question for a second. And in that question was, folks feel like there's a lack of information on when they're biting and on what. Yeah, it's tough. Walleye are a technical fish to fish for. What I would suggest, I have seen a few videos on YouTube about walleye fishing in Lake Pend Oreille. I don't know what the current availability of those are. I've seen those in the past. You might look for some of those. I actually think I saw one as well for some techniques on how to catch them in the Clark Fork River itself. So more of a flowing water approach versus a flat water approach. So you might look for some of those. What I would say, one of the big pushes for our research program in the coming year is to try and put more effort into getting more frequent telemetry data available to anglers. We've got some technical hurdles to get over to do that. These are data intensive studies and you got to separate the wheat from the chaff before you can share that out to folks, but we are going to make a big push on that. So we're at least hoping to be able to provide the public with more information on where to go when, and also how deep to be fishing. And we certainly found that in our sampling, understanding some of that depth information was really helpful for targeting these fish. So I'll leave it at that for now, but hopefully that answers both those questions a little.
All right, thank you, Matt. The next
Can I
question.
add something real quick on that one?
Go for it.
I was just going to add at the very end, Matt was talking about resources for walleye fishing, and I would just throw out there as well that there have been a number of local seminars to help with this. I know in the Sandpoint area, I believe through North 40 and through Marks Marine down in the Hayden area, there have been seminars in the past. And so, again, keep an eye out for those types of opportunities locally, because there's been some good efforts to help folks in our area learn how to be more effective walleye anglers.
All right, Andy, this next question is actually for you. Does Fish and Game have record of populations of lake whitefish by year, or an overall percentage of LPO population? They keep hearing rumors of 70% of the system.
Yeah, well, we don't monitor lake whitefish anywhere near as intensively as a lot of the other fish in the lake, but we did a pretty intensive study back in 2007. We actually had a graduate student working specifically on lake whitefish. One of the interesting pieces of the study was they evaluated whether the lake whitefish population had potential to support commercial harvest. This was done in the early days of the lake trout suppression program, and we were trying to figure out if there was any ability to commercially harvest lake whitefish and use some of the proceeds from that type of an operation to offset some of the costs of lake trout suppression. And long and the short of that was the project concluded that the Pend Oreille population was strong enough that it could support somewhere in the neighborhood of about 85,000 pounds of whitefish a year and have that be sustainable, as I recall, somewhere in that, very close to that number. We ended up not pursuing that for a lot of other reasons that just didn't make it a very cost-effective thing to consider. But certainly I can tell this person that from a biomass standpoint, or if you think of that, about that as the total weight of fish, flesh. Lake whitefish do make up a big chunk of the biomass in Lake Pend Oreille. We don't have an ability to quantify that and know just how much. I also can add that lake whitefish habitat it is mostly in areas that are less than 250 feet deep. If you look at other systems where lake whitefish are native, they typically occupy those portions of lakes that are less than 250 feet deep. So we don't have lake whitefish all over the lake. If you were to go out into the main basin of the lake in 1,000 feet of water, you're probably not going to encounter too many, but certainly in places like the north end of the lake where we have a lot of water that's, in those 250 foot depths or less, lake whitefish are pretty abundant in places. So we also have started here just in the last year or so doing a bit of work with lake whitefish that are incidentally caught in the lake trout program, so that we can start having a better idea what the population trend is doing for lake whitefish. But we've started that very recently, and it'll be some time before we have enough years of data to really see if that population is staying pretty stable or increasing or decreasing. But anecdotally, from what we see in bycatch and the netting program, lake whitefish are still quite abundant in the lake, and seem to be at least relatively stable from what we can tell.
All right, thank you. This next question is directed towards Ken. Ken, where have the bull trout numbers stood over the years?
Kara, I'm going to go ahead and get started on that one, and we'll turn it back over to Ken if he has anything to add. Give me a second to bring up a slide here. So this slide here shows the trend in red abundance over time. And so red counts are nests, bull trout nests in the tributaries throughout the lake. And as you can see, there's a lot of fluctuation over time in the abundance of reds. The numbers in the last couple of years have been down from the average sum, but they are well within the range of what we've observed going back to the beginning of these surveys. And while we pay attention to the fact that red counts are down, we're not overly concerned at this point. And one of those reasons is we're learning that bull trout abundance is more than just red counts. And the reason for that is that a large number of the adult bull trout in Lake Pend Oreille appear not to be spawning necessarily every single year. And so a lot of fish do spawn annually, but there are a fair number of fish that skip spawn or go 2 or 3 years between spawning, or in any way, at any rate, are large enough fish to be adults but are not spawning. We encounter a large number of these fish in the fall during our lake trout netting operations. And over the years, we've been able to tag, I think it's something in the neighborhood of 8,000 total 8,000 total bull trout in the system. And using those tags, it's a PIT tag, passive integrated transponder. It's the same electronic tag technology that gets used in salmon and steelhead programs in the Columbia Basin. And we're able to scan those fish and when we catch them, and know where that fish was initially tagged and how long it's grown. And over time, when you accumulate those data, you're able to estimate both survival and also abundance. And so looking at abundance from this standpoint, we built a model that integrates both the red count data on one hand and this PIT tag information on the other hand, to tell us in a life cycle context how many fish are out there. And so I'll point you to this graph on the left here that shows the really erratic variation in the number of juveniles that are out there in the system on any given year. But really what ends up happening is as those variations in juveniles get sort of evened out by environmental processes, whether it's floods or just limited space in tributaries or predation, any of the things that happen to small fish. What we find is that by the time they hit adults, and that's this graph on the right here, our population abundance is really pretty stable out there in the system. It does vary, it goes up, it goes down, but I think what this kind of shows is the resiliency of these fish. And that resiliency is promoted by our management out there, having that both a cold place to, to weather that. Bull trout really prefer super cold water. And so having a cold place to go when it's hot in the summertime, and oh, by the way, it's full of abundant kokanee, that makes great habitat for bull trout. And so that's why we see a lot more stability in adult abundance versus the counts of females that spawned in any given year. And that's kind of where bull trout have been over the years. And it's one of the really interesting ways we're able to use fish that we catch on the net boat. We mark with a tag and release them, and then we catch a large number of those fish at a later date after they've gone and done their thing for a year or two, and learn a lot more about the system.
All right. Our next question here is, what are you doing to mitigate uncontrolled immigration from upstream in the Clark Fork River? In certain years, there is potential for a large number of juvenile predators to be swept downstream from Montana reservoirs. Have you devised any approaches to monitor or mitigate those occurrences, given that Montana does not seem interested in suppressing northern pike or walleye?
Yeah, so I think the short answer to that is our predator suppression programs is direct mitigation for fish coming downstream on us. And that's why we're doing a lot of what we're doing. So more specifically, to try to monitor these types of things, that does get difficult. Specifically answering the question, how many, for instance, walleye are being produced in Montana and drifting down to Lake Pend Oreille, and how many are being produced in the lake itself right now. So through the Clark Fork Settlement Agreement, we are working on one project right now to help try to answer that question. It's a strontium isotope project is where we started with it. And basically what that is on the otoliths or the ear bones of the fish, they lay down bone like rings on a tree kind of. And so the strontium ratios on their otoliths is directly related to the strontium ratios within the water where they're living. And due to differences in geology, the strontium isotope ratios are different depending on where the water originates and the rocks that they flow over. So it looks like right now, we're still working on it, but it looks like right now there's a possibility that we will be able to tell by looking at the juvenile, the center of the otolith, when those fish were juveniles or even as eggs, even the water where their mothers were actually living when they produced the eggs. So we're working on that, and it looks like there might be a possibility for us to be able to tell, and then we can use that to estimate how much is coming down as drift and how much of that is coming down being produced internally. And then the other part of that is, are they coming down as larvae, or are they coming down as fish, and at what life stage? So stay tuned on that one. The other thing that's going on, though, is Montana is tagging a number of walleye as part of their monitoring programs with pit tags like Matt just discussed. We are surveying the fish that we catch and the fish that are turned into the angler incentive program for those tags. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think we've caught any of those yet, but it is another tool that's out there.
All right, thank you, Ken. Our next question here is for Andy. Andy, how did the walleye and pike get introduced into our lake?
Sure. Well, in both cases with walleye and northern pike, these were most likely the result of illegal introductions that occurred in Montana and fish that then naturally moved down the Clark Fork system and eventually into Idaho. The part we do know is that the illegal introductions did occur in northwest Montana for both of these species. The part that we can't know for sure is whether or not an angler could have, for example, gone to northwest Montana and brought some fish illegally into Idaho, or if it just occurred over time that these fish moved through the system naturally and eventually got into Idaho. Either way, illegal introduction was the original source. In the case of pike, that happened a longer time period ago. We had, I think in the 1970s was the first time a pike was documented in the Clark Fork system below Cabinet Gorge Dam. So there's been evidence of those fish in the system for many decades, but it's really been just over the last 10 years that we've really started to see pike really gain a foothold in Pend Oreille and in the larger system in Idaho. We've seen that increasing here, especially over the last 5 years. With walleye, it was a little later than that. The early 1990s was the original illegal introduction in Montana. And then it took a little longer, and it was in the early 2000s when we had the first walleye confirmed in one of our fish and game surveys in the lake. So, and I think there were likely maybe a few fish that were caught even before that by anglers in Idaho. So long story short, illegal introductions are what originally got these fish here.
All right, thank you. Our next question. I catch a lot of bull trout while fishing. They always wind themselves up in the line. Why can't we have a 1 or 2 daily limit to save the ones that die? And how do I obtain a catch log?
Well, I'll start with the first part of that question. And that's related to why can't we have some harvest opportunity for bull trout? It's a great question. It's something that we've actively been working towards. To start with, it's important to understand that bull trout harvest is regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because the species is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. That means the Fish and Wildlife Service has management authority for those fish. And so in order for us to offer some kind of harvest opportunity, we would have to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service and have them permit that. Now, the good news is that Pend Oreille is one of the strongest bull trout populations in the species range. So even though bull trout are struggling in other places, and that's really what led to them being listed, Pend Oreille is one of the bright spots on the map. And we, through our work, are building a case that we have a strong enough bull trout population that we think that we have an opportunity in the future to offer some kind of limited harvest opportunity. And we'd really like to at least be able to provide that opportunity to anglers if they want it. So in order for that to happen, like I said, we'll continue to work with Fish and Wildlife Service. There's currently what's called a five-year status assessment occurring for bull trout, basically a review of how bull trout are doing. And when that is complete, I think we're going to be in a better position to sit down with the Fish and Wildlife Service and have some more direct conversations about whether there's an opportunity to provide harvest in Pend Oreille, even though most other places that's not going to be an option for bull trout. So bottom line, stay tuned. We think that there's a possibility of that in the future, and we're going to keep working toward it.
So I want to follow up real quick. There was a question in there about angler logs, and folks who are interested in the angler log program can contact me either at my email address right here, and I'll leave this slide up here while I'm talking, or give us a call at the regional office there, and that's the phone number. One other thing I'd like to add is part of that bull trout evaluation I was talking about earlier in that modeling we were doing was also looking forward and asking the question, what would happen to the bull trout population, say, if we reduce the amount of netting mortality we had each year on bull trout? Because we do have about 300 fish or so a year that are mortalities in the netting programs. And what would happen if we added some harvest for anglers? And the short answer on those is the netting mortality is such a small proportion of the total population that it doesn't change our predictions for where the population's heading. So netting doesn't appear to be having a population level impact. That right there tells you that if we, as we get closer to our goal for lake trout abundance, where we'll, and I think Andy may talk about this in a bit, there's another question coming up. As we get towards our goal on lake trout, we're hoping to be able to dial back netting, and that those fish that wouldn't be killed in the netting program would be ostensibly available for harvest. In addition to that, we modeled what would happen if 15%, up to 15% of the adult bull trout were removed by angler harvest, and that didn't change the answer in terms of long-term stability. And so what that model tells us is that from a population dynamic standpoint, we have the opportunity biologically to potentially offer some low level of harvest. But as Andy mentioned, we've got some ground to cover on that.
All right, thank you, Matt. Our next question is Montana doing anything to control the walleye population in the Clark Fork River?
Yeah, I think Ken may have hit on this in the question he answered a little bit ago, but the short answer is no. There still hasn't been any kind of a suppression approach adopted in Montana. And so there certainly is a higher density of walleye up there. That's been the source of what we're dealing with. And at this point, we're mostly focused on trying to understand, how many walleye we may be, gaining from Montana, so to speak, or if most of our walleye are coming from reproduction in Idaho. But Ken touched on that earlier, and we'll be continuing to evaluate that.
All right, thank you, Andy. Our next question here is, how was the analysis of the marina at Trestle Creek conducted, and what will the effects be on our fishery?
Yeah, so this is something that we didn't talk about as part of the State of the Lake presentation, so I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail on it. There's a proposal to build a marina and some lots and some housing at the mouth of Trestle Creek. And I just want to point out and be real clear that Fish and Game doesn't regulate land use. We do provide comments on proposals like this and permits, but the permitting for this is a federal and a state and local issue. So we have provided extensive comments on this proposed development. We pointed out the resources in the area and potential impacts to those resources. One of the things that keeps coming up is that Trestle Creek is a bull trout stream, and what can be done about that. And I'd like to point out there that the Fish and Wildlife Service, through their consultation with the Army Corps of Engineers, like Andy just said, Fish and Wildlife Service, because they are threatened species, deals with bull trout issues, and they provide comments to the Corps. So it's difficult on a project, on any sort of development project, to quantify direct impacts, but it's something that we definitely have weighed in on. So for more details on this, I think it's probably better to just give our main office a call, and we can direct you to somebody to help answer any further questions.
All right, thank you, Ken. Our next question here is for Matt. Matt, if Kokanee numbers were at an all-time high last year, then why would there be a reason to continue gill netting for walleye?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to answer that, I kind of want to take a little bit of a history lesson here and remind folks that when we started netting for lake trout about 15 years ago, the Kokanee population was on the verge of collapse. And, you know, a lot of the anglers in the area referred to Lake Pend Oreille as the Dead Sea during some of those years because really fishing was not all that great for a lot of things. The reason the fishery has come back and is good for many species right now is because that fishery is propped up by abundant Kokanee populations. So if you fast forward to what we were starting to see in 2017, we're seeing walleye on an exponential growth curve that is very similar to what we observed for lake trout back in the mid to late 90s. And really what we wanted to do there by jumping on walleye quickly was we wanted to make sure that walleye didn't get to the level of predation that lake trout did. And so this wasn't a case of being reactive as much as it was a case of being proactive for walleye. And so back to your question about if Kokanee are super abundant, well, that's by design. I mean, that's what props up the fishery. That's what you know, really gives Lake Pend Oreille its character. Lake Pend Oreille is noted for its trophy species, whether we're talking rainbows, brown trout, walleye, lake trout, they all achieve trophy sizes there. We have a great fishery for trophy smallmouth. And all of those fisheries to one extent or another are built on the backs of Kokanee. And so that's why we're being aggressive with walleye at this point, even though Kokanee abundance is high. We don't want to be reactive. The other part of that is every single one of those predators that are out there are substantially longer lived than Kokanee are. And so if mysis recover and there's not as much food available for Kokanee, or, you know, Kokanee populations naturally cycle up and down as it is. And if we end up in a point where the Kokanee population is in a strong down cycle, whether it's due to mysis abundance or whether it's due to Kokanee competition, and the lake is absolutely chock full of a diverse array of very large, long-lived predators, we're going to be in a world of hurt in a big hurry. And, you know, that again is a scenario we've seen borne out in other regional waters that are very similar to Lake Pend Oreille, Priest, Flathead, Kootenai Lake. All of those places have had collapses in their trophy fisheries in one way or another because the Kokanee population collapsed. And we're trying to avoid that with walleye.
Yeah, Matt said that well, but I would like to add just a bit to it. Again, the history lesson here. In the early 1990s, that's the last time we saw Kokanee densities that were, you know, similar to what we've seen here the last few years. And at that same time, that's when the rainbow trout fishery was, you know, firing on all cylinders. That's the last time that we saw. For example, in the presentation, Matt showed the number of patch fish that were caught in the early 1990s when the Kokanee population was at an extremely high level. Things were firing on all cylinders in that window from like 1990 to 1994, somewhere in there. And keep in mind that it probably was pretty easy if you were looking at the lake and in that time period saying, well, we've got tons of Kokanee out here and we've got big predators. And what happened? We had lake trout start to emerge right after that and start to reach increasing densities. And I guarantee there were people that were saying, well, let's just add more lake, or yeah, look, this is great. We've got lake trout coming on. That'll just be one more predator that we can fish for. And by 2000, we had closed the Kokanee fishery because that predation from lake trout in that short time period had started the Kokanee collapse. And so this stuff can happen very fast, and we have to be very mindful of that. And there's the example I just gave from Pend Oreille that drives that home. There's examples from currently in Kokanee Lake, where this has also been an issue, where you can go from having a fantastic fishery with a pile of kokanee and then having predation get ahead of you, and it can flip very fast. And so again, we just have to be mindful of that in our management.
All right, thank you. Our next question here is, how can we as anglers help Fish and Game realize that we want to keep walleye and pike in the lake?
Well, we certainly realize that there are anglers who really like to fish for walleye and pike, and there's good reason for that. They're fantastic sport fish, very popular in a lot of areas. The thing that we need to recognize, though, is that, again, this is that history. We have this history of a fishery in Lake Pend Oreille that's been built on the backs of kokanee. We've had a history of having native fish in the system like cutthroat trout and bull trout. And we have had for many decades very strong support from anglers for managing for that type of fishery. And we've had major investments in recovering that fishery once, the kokanee population declined. And we have data from creel surveys and other sources that continue to show that the majority of effort is directed at these other species. And certainly the interest is growing for species like walleye and pike, no question about that. But it comes back to, again, I'm going to keep hitting on this, that what species are compatible and which species are incompatible. And walleye and pike, they just are enough of a risk to the sustainability of this fishery that we can't encourage those species to be more abundant. I mentioned this earlier, those fish are going to be there at a low density into the future. We just can't encourage those species to be doing better and to be more abundant. So yeah, again, certainly we recognize there's plenty of folks out there that really enjoy fishing for those. But again, in order to manage this fishery for the long term and be able to meet our obligations for native species and some of our other fisheries management objectives, yeah, we're just going to have to manage against those species.
All right, thanks, Andy. Our next question is for Matt. Matt, in your presentation, you discussed small kokanee sizes the past 2 years and rapid growth of walleye the past 2 years because of a low growing population. Are there too many kokanee for the amount of food available? And is that a risk that they will overeat and collapse their food supply?
Yeah, give me a second to pull up a graph here for illustration purposes. So the person who asked that question, what they're driving at is this trend, especially in the last couple of years here, of kokanee that are smaller than certainly we'd like to see them. This blue line here is the trend in length over time. And on this graph, I put a red line at a 10-inch. This thing has been a pain. Let's try that again. Okay. Anyway, the blue line is length over time. We've seen these smaller fish in the last couple of years. We have seen 10-inch fish in the system, and that was at a point in time when kokanee were at very low abundances. I think what this question is pretty astute, and what it's recognizing is that as kokanee densities go up, their sizes do tend to go down. Now, we have seen some improvement in that size over the last couple of years, and that is because when kokanee size goes down, the number of eggs they lay goes down, and when the per female, and when that number of eggs goes down in the system, it kind of naturally lowers the abundance for later generations, or it often does. And so that's part of the reason we see those natural cycles in kokanee populations. As for their ability to collapse the food base entirely, That's not something we've seen in the entire history of Kokanee and Lake Pend Oreille, or really in a lot of other waters for that matter. And that's really because, at least from a collapse from a intra-specific or interspecies or within species competition. And that's because they do have this rapid density dependent response where their densities go up, so their egg laying goes down, and so does abundance. Now, we are seeing an improvement over the last couple of years in length, and I expect to see even more improvement, maybe more towards the 9 or pushing towards the 10-inch range of adult fish in this coming year. And I say that because the length of the 2-year-olds that are coming into the fishery in this coming year is very much improved from what it has been, and that's because those densities are lower. I think the other great thing about this question is it recognizes that the reason that walleye are growing very well right now is because they are low abundance relative to their food base. And that is one advantage of keeping walleye at low abundances is they grow very rapidly. And so while the density may be lower, the quality of the fish is much higher generally because they reach large sizes much more quickly. So it waits to be seen what happens in 2021 as far as the length of these adult fish that anglers are going to be chasing in the Kokanee fishery. I think there is reason for some optimism, but I think in general, folks got to recognize that Lake Pend Oreille really never has been one of those fisheries that kicks out, 16 to 20 inch Kokanee. It's always been a fishery that's been kind of defined by that, smoker canner sized fish, but that's still a real popular activity for folks to do. And it is fine eating. So folks should take advantage of it. The people that did get out last year, especially in the early summer up on the north end, they caught some really nice fish, and a bunch of those may have been 4-year-olds, or they may have just been some faster growing Kokanee. But in general, the people who get out and try in Lake Pend Oreille in recent years are having a good time doing it. And so I encourage folks to get out there and give it a shot this year.
All right, thank you, Matt. This next question is for Andy. Andy, I'm always interested in the most abundant and never talked about lake whitefish population and their consumption of resources that could be used by native species, plankton, and other nutrients that could support more Kokanee. Has there been any consideration to reduce their population through netting?
Yeah, we talked a bit about lake whitefish earlier, and how we certainly have done some work on lake whitefish, but we don't monitor them as intensively. One thing I would say to start this one is that lake whitefish were introduced to the lake in the late 1800s. So they've been in the system for a really long time. That also meant that they were in the system for quite a period of time before we started to see other non-natives like Kokanee and rainbow trout, and certainly some of the more recent non-natives become established. And there wasn't any evidence that for the many decades that lake whitefish were present, that they were causing notable issues for native species. We had a lot of years where cutthroat bull trout, and at the time mountain whitefish were really abundant in the system. And of course, a lot of folks know there used to be a super popular commercial fishery, when mountain whitefish were abundant. And so there wasn't evidence that lake whitefish were having a major issue in terms of competition with native fish. So I don't think there's anything we need to worry about that way. As far as their diet, we haven't really done a formal diet study, but we have looked at diet kind of casually over the years. We do know that lake whitefish do eat some mysis shrimp, and a lot of their diet's made up of invertebrates. They also feed along the lake bottom. That's part of why they don't go out in the hundreds of feet deep part of the lake. They're usually in less than a couple hundred feet of water, pretty closely associated with the bottom, eating various invertebrates. In some systems, lake whitefish will eat small fish like perch fry. We don't see that so much in Pend Oreille, near as we can tell, but in other systems like Flathead Lake, that occurs. And it seems like there might be something going on there where in systems where lake whitefish are keyed into things like perch fry, that they may be a little more vulnerable to being caught by anglers. In Lake Pend Oreille, anglers generally struggle to catch lake whitefish There are some folks that have some success with it, especially, jigging in the wintertime. But generally they're a very difficult sport fish in Pend Oreille, and at least we are hypothesizing that may have something to do with the fact that their diet is a little more focused on, invertebrates rather than small fish. So bottom line, we don't have any plans on doing any kind of netting program for Lake Whitefish, because at least as of now, there's not really any compelling evidence to suggest that would be beneficial.
All right, thanks, Andy. I think you may be able to answer this next one too. Your presentation lumps FWIN catch rates of Lake Pend Oreille and Pend Oreille River, giving an inaccurate picture of the density of walleye in the lake. The creel survey you cited did not include the Pend Oreille River. This seems like a misrepresentation of the data. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, that's a two-part question. So we'll start with the first part about the FWIN survey for walleye giving an inaccurate picture because I'm trying to read that one more time. Yeah, so basically our FWIN survey, we're looking at walleye catch rates from the lake itself as well as through the Pend Oreille River. And I don't think that's a misrepresentation. We know that this is an open system. Matt showed in his presentation that walleye are moving a lot. They're moving from the Clark Fork into the lake, from the lake into the Pend Oreille River. Highly mobile species. This is an open system. And so we're trying to do the best job we can of understanding, the trend of the walleye population system-wide. An important part of that, and I think I may kick this over to Matt to maybe illustrate it a little bit better, is that we are seeing that there's some differences between the catch rates in that FWIN survey in the river versus the lake. We've seen a decline in catch rates in the lake itself, but in the Pend Oreille River, we actually saw an uptick in our catch rates during this most recent FWIN. So Matt, I'll kick it over to you to maybe focus in on that a little more.
Yeah, give me just a second. I'll get my screen shared again. Okay, so this is the graph I showed in our presentation regarding our FWIN results from 2020. And the way I presented it there is I noted that the trend in abundance from 2011 to 14 to 17 was on this exponential growth curve. And so we had both from this model, this growth model that's fit to these data, and from a model that a walleye researcher from Ottawa named Nigel Lestry, he's one of the world's experts on walleye, built another model for us that predicted basically essentially the same thing, that abundance was likely to double once more in Lake Pend Oreille from 2017 to 2020 if we didn't do any suppression activity because of how that population was growing. And he used a habitat-based model, whereas we used a population-based model. So this is where the abundance would have been had we not been operating our suppression programs, both netter and angler suppression. And is it not? We're good? Okay. But to get to this person's question about abundance, if we were to have plotted the point for abundance in the Pend Oreille River alone, it would have been right here. So it wouldn't have shown the same kind of growth that we were expecting. And I think that speaks to the highly mobile nature of this species, and the fact that, when we're netting fish in the lake, or when anglers are catching fish in the Clark Fork River, those are also fish that would use the Pend Oreille River at some point in time. But nonetheless, abundance was in the neighborhood of 5 fish per net, or maybe a little higher in the Pend Oreille River. Abundance was actually quite a bit lower in the lake. But when we have done these surveys, we're looking at them on a system-wide basis, like Andy mentioned. And so when we bring that information all together, that's how we come up with this abundance estimate that's kind of in between what was in the lake and what we observed in the river. And I think it's probably all I'll say about that at this point, is that there's no misrepresentation there. We're pooling across all of those samples so that we can understand what's going on system wide. But we'll be very transparent with folks about what the abundances were in both places, and I mentioned that in my presentation.
So there's another piece to that question, I believe, which was during our last creel survey, it was only done in the lake, not in the Pend Oreille River. And this seems to, the question reads, this seems like intentional misrepresentation of data. Will it continue? Well, it is correct that during our last creel survey, 2014-15, it was done in the lake itself. It was not done in the Pend Oreille River. We do not often get opportunities to do these year-long creel surveys. They're incredibly resource intensive, so we only get to do them periodically. And we focused on the lake during that creel because that's where most of the action happens in this system, and everything kind of revolves around the lake. Certainly the other fisheries, like in the Clark Fork River and the Pend Oreille River, are very important. And we certainly are looking for opportunity to be able to get a creel survey done in the Pend Oreille River at some point in the future. That hasn't happened yet. It's not a place where we have any recent creel data to look at, but certainly there is warm water angling that occurs in the Pend Oreille River, and that may elevate the overall estimate of how much warm water angling occurs system wide. But in that creel survey in the presentation, you saw me show that about 40% of the angler effort was targeted at kokanee, another 40% at rainbow trout. And so that's an incredible amount of effort. And I'm confident that even if we had the Pend Oreille River factored into that the fishing for those traditional species would still far outweigh the angling for warm water fish. And so as far as an intentional misrepresentation of data, of course not. We certainly strive to be transparent and represent things as fairly as possible. And I think this meeting is a good example of that. We just put together close to a 2-hour presentation to share this information, having this meeting tonight to answer questions. That certainly should speak to, our desire to be transparent and not misrepresent anything. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Andy. Matt, this next question is for you. Walleye density in Lake Pend Oreille was higher and the fishing for them better in 2017 than it is now. What proof do you have that walleye at higher densities were negatively impacting the overall trout fishery?
Yeah, I think that the asker of this question is right. Walleye densities were higher in 2017. I think that has borne out in our FWIN survey. And it stands to reason that fishing likely would have been, at least catch rates would have been better for them in 2017 as well. As far as proof that they were negatively impacting the trout fishery at that time, I think at those abundances and the availability of food that was out there at the time, at that point, there was not a negative impact. But again, this management approach is about keeping walleye at a lower density and maintaining them at a lower density over time, so that if there are downward swings in the prey base, and we have certainly seen many examples throughout the region where walleye are able to drastically change the prey base. If we saw a downswing in that prey base, that's when walleye would become a problem, and we're managing proactively to make sure that doesn't happen.
All right, thank you. The next question we have here is, what is the life cycle of the rainbow trout in the lake, and how does it affect fishing for them?
I can take that one. So rainbow trout, at least the rainbow trout, the large trophy-sized Girard rainbows that folks are really interested in, are primarily in the Lightning Creek and Clark Fork, and also in Pack River. And so that's an important part of the life cycle there. They tend to spend a couple of years, 2 or 3 years in those tributary systems before they out migrate to the lake and start growing. One of the really interesting things we've learned over the last few years is that these higher abundances of kokanee, once they hit the lake and they start turning on to kokanee as their primary food resource, they're growing very rapidly, and they're growing about 4 inches more in 5 years than they were several years ago. And so kokanee are a huge part of that. They start hitting maturity probably at about anywhere from ages 5 and up, and they return to natal spawning habitats. We don't have a great idea of what spawning fidelity is. In other words, how closely they associate to where they were born, but they spawn and the cycle begins anew. So.
All right, thank you, Matt. Our next question here is, do you have a good example of walleye causing the collapse of a bull trout population?
Yeah, I can take that one. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a good example of that, but the important part here is that there haven't really been too many situations where walleye have been introduced on top of bull trout, particularly strong bull trout populations. Walleye are now pretty widespread throughout the West, but more commonly they're found in reservoirs and large river systems in the West. There have not been very many examples where walleye have been introduced into systems with an abundant bull trout population like Pend Oreille. What I can say is that bull trout in Lake Pend Oreille are very dependent on an abundant kokanee food source. And we certainly know that if we can't continue to support a strong kokanee population, that likely is going to be a disadvantage for bull trout in this system. And so that's certainly one of the reasons that we're concerned about their presence. If they impact that kokanee food supply, that certainly is going to be a negative for bull trout. Another piece of this that could be important is walleye certainly occupy habitats in, for example, the river and in areas like the mouths of tributaries where bull trout are migrating, out as juveniles or back into spawning streams as adults. But in particular, juveniles that are coming out of these streams and into the lake are going to be vulnerable to predation by walleye. And so we're trying to understand more about what that dynamic might look like. Certainly no question, though, that walleye are a threat to bull trout on a couple different fronts, both in terms of competition for a common prey base as well as direct predation on bull trout.
All right, Andy, we've got another question for you here. What is the thermocline in the lake and how does it affect fishing?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And so in lakes like Lake Pend Oreille, and when we get our warmer summer weather, lakes typically do what we call stratifying. So as we move into the later part of June and into July, it just kind of depends in a given year, but usually somewhere in that late June or early July period, we will have had enough warm weather by then that the warm or the surface waters of the lake will warm and we'll end up with this warmer layer of surface water, and then somewhere in the neighborhood of commonly in that 40, 50 or so foot depth range, you'll then end up with a really small depth range where temperature changes rapidly. And so we may have temperatures in that upper 40 or 50 feet of the water column that are all relatively consistent in the summertime, especially that July, August window and even into the fall a little bit. And then you'll end up with that rapid temperature change that may occur over about a 10 or 15 foot depth span. And that's a really important area for fish. For example, kokanee will feed up in the upper portion of the water column and then commonly drop down below that thermocline into cooler water, digest the food they've eaten shallower. Thermocline is also an area where fish that like colder temperatures, for example, a bull trout is a great example, will hang in that thermocline area and take advantage of the cooler waters and have close access to be able to move up into shallower, warmer water and feed on fish that are located there. So as far as anglers are concerned, a thermocline is often an area to really focus your attention because it's kind of an attraction area for fish in that summer period. And that's a good place to focus your effort, especially if you're a fisherman who's trolling. For example, any of the number of predators in the lake that are consuming kokanee, that's certainly a great place to focus your efforts.
All right, thanks, Andy. Don't go too far. I've got another question for you here. Has there been any thoughts of having a catch and release season for bass in the late May, early June timeframe to protect bass reproduction?
Yeah, this is a question we get periodically. And the bottom line is in the Panhandle, we typically see very high catch and release practices from anglers, even though we do allow a harvest of bass. When we've done tagging studies to look at harvest rates, it's pretty common that we see more than 90% of the fish caught by anglers, bass caught by anglers, are released. So we don't see much harvest-oriented bass angling occur. And as a result of that, it's not that important for us to have more restrictive regulations. And certainly bass are more catchable, especially bigger bass in that spring window when they're in shallower water and spawning. Yeah, I think most bass anglers understand that's one of the most effective times to target bigger fish. But these fish certainly can sustain catch and release, are capable of surviving after being caught and released. And that's not just something we've seen here, but that's been well documented, in many areas throughout the range of bass. And so just not a place we've had to go there yet. And we've seen that with the regs we have in place, we've been able to sustain strong bass populations and still have quality size structure of our bass. So we've tried not to limit that opportunity since it's biologically not being problematic.
All right, thanks, Andy. This next question here is for Matt. It's actually a rather funny one. Did the fellas in the submarine use upriggers?
It's actually a little known fact the Navy's tried to keep it top secret, but those submarines are actually just really big downriggers that they're testing for their battleships.
Great answer. All right, this next question is for Andy here. Andy, has barbless hooks been considered for catch and release? And what about no limit in the number of lines?
Yeah, I guess it's a pretty generic question. I guess I'll just assume that they're mostly talking about, fishing in the lake environment. Bottom line, there's been a lot of work done on the effects of barb versus barbless hooks. And from a biological standpoint, there's really not much of a difference. It certainly can be easier for certain anglers to release fish with hooks that are not barbed. But in terms of the survival of fish after they've been released from either barbed or barbless hooks, there's a body of evidence to suggest that that's not really that big a deal. There certainly are places where there are barbless hooks restrictions. A lot of that's been driven more by social desires, angler preferences, more so than fishery science. So at this point, that's not something that we're really looking at.
All right, thanks, Andy. So this next one's kind of like a comment and question. I'm pretty sure that Fish and Game has not declined a bounty on targeted fish. The payout is limited only by the number of claims, not by how much is spent. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, sure. I think what that question is talking about is the Angler Incentive Program and participation by anglers. Specifically with the Walleye program, the payout is $15 a fish. And yeah, we don't turn people away. I mean, we don't have a limit on how many people, how many fish we pay for or anything like that in a year. So yeah, I think that's what that comment was talking about. It's a little bit different with walleye. And the reason why we had to set it up a little bit differently with walleye is because of the fact that there are other nearby walleye populations around, and that it's possible that people might be bringing walleye from specifically, either upstream in Montana or downstream at Roosevelt or something, and turning them into the program. So to deal with that problem, what we did is we made the big money fish have to be caught in Pend Oreille, and that's where we put a coated wire tag in the snout of those fish. And so, we've released approximately 100 fish over the last couple of years with those tags, and those fish are worth $1,000 a piece. And then just to keep it interesting, we also have $1,000 payouts per month. So so each fish that you do catch that month, each walleye that you submit that month gets entered into a drawing for those $1,000 payouts.
Thanks, Ken. This next question is from Matt. Matt, why can't we spend more money hatchery raising kokanee to supplement the predator appetite?
It's a good question. In some ways we do. So I think we're on track to plant something like 5 million additional kokanee fry into the system this coming year. We've planted up to 10 million kokanee fry in the system, and that is on top of the wild natural production that's going on, which is actually quite high these days. And honestly, if food resources for kokanee were unlimited, that would be a great idea. But unfortunately, the system is ultimately bounded by food resources for kokanee, and then how much kokanee flesh you can produce, and how much of that kokanee flesh we can convert into this myriad of apex predators we have in the system. And yeah, that's the long and the short of it, is that we do supplement the hatchery, supplement the lake with hatchery fish, and we do that as fail-safe to avoid another collapse. But as I described earlier, when you have highly abundant kokanee, that is a good thing for predator growth. It is not necessarily a good thing for kokanee growth. And so it does negatively impact the kokanee fishery to have ultra abundant kokanee out there. So the last couple of years, those kokanee abundances have moderated some, and that's driven by both the number of hatchery fish we're able to put out, which is ultimately driven by female size of the adults and how many eggs we're able to collect from those, which is likewise what drives ultimately how many wild fry are produced. So we do have a large kokanee hatchery program. It's a big part of our management here, and they do supplement predator appetites.
All right, thanks, Matt. I do have another question for you here. While looking for lake trout, a nice size 10+ pound rainbow was hooked at 125 feet. What in the world is a female rainbow doing down there at this time of year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess driving at the idea that maybe that female, well, a couple of things. One, that female ought to be up in a tributary spawning, and also what the heck is it doing at 125 feet? And the first one's easy. Kokanee definitely use habitats down that deep. And when they're spread throughout the water column, they're going to follow zooplankton wherever they are, and rainbows will follow kokanee wherever they are. As for why it's not spawning, a 10-pound rainbow, yeah, that's probably a mature fish, but Girard rainbows do mature a little later, and at the rates they're growing right now, perhaps she's going to spawn next year, or perhaps she's going to spawn this year and she just hasn't made her trip yet. Fact of the matter is that fish this size in a system like this could go from being at 125 feet in Idlewild Bay down by Bayview on one day and be up Lightning Creek the next. So it's an interesting question though, and a cool observation. I would add to that we have had a number of those types of observations. So We have been occasionally catching pike at 80 or 100 feet, and anglers have too. We have caught walleye in 120 feet. And those are fish that folks don't normally associate with being deep water critters, but in Lake Pend Oreille they are, because there's resources there. You know, a pelagic fish like a rainbow, if the food's there, it will be too.
All right, thank you, Matt. This next question is for Andy. Andy, if I catch a pike or walleye and don't want to eat it, what is the recommended disposal method?
Sure. Well, both pike and walleye are classified as game fish, which means that you can't waste the fish. But that said, if you're not into eating those fish, it's certainly legal to give them away. You have friends or family, I guarantee you're going to make a lot of friends if you bring walleye back and give those out to some people. You know, you're going to be a popular person in a hurry, because I don't know too many people that would turn those down. And pike as well. There's plenty of people that really like to eat pike. So that'd be my recommendation. Another option is, you know, just like we do, we're giving fish to local food banks. And, you know, I have to believe that if you were to bring some fish by a food bank or maybe some other community centers, if you are a part of a church or something like that, I think there's certainly ways like that you can get fish into the hands of people that would appreciate having it.
All right, thank you, Andy. Matt, this next question is for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about how important the logbooks are to gather data?
Yeah, the logbook program is a really cool opportunity for rainbow anglers, actually any angler. We would give logbooks to any anglers that are out there, because the data are very useful to us. But for rainbow trout in particular, these rainbows are pelagic fish. As such, they are difficult to sample with really any gear other than rod and reel in a troll fishery, or with rod and reel in the tributaries. And that's because they are spring spawners, so they're only in the tributaries when conditions are pretty tough to be sampling fish there. There's high flows, water's cold. You know, it's just, they're hard critters to get your hands on with kind of what we typically use in fishery monitoring. Logbooks, that's right. The logbooks are kind of our primary means by which we can gather information about the rainbow trout fishery. And so we have worked with anglers in the past to collect information on catch rates, the size of the fish they're catching, and the distribution in those sizes. And we can look at those trends over time, and it's a really good way to take temperature on the rainbow population. In addition, many of those anglers elect to take fin rays off of the pectoral fins, the front fins, for us in the fall. And that's the point in time when we're able to take those fin rays and we can mount them in an epoxy. We can cut them with a special saw that cuts them very thin, and then look at those under a microscope. And we can age those fish in a process that's not too dissimilar from aging tree rings, quite frankly. The other cool thing about that is by measuring the distances between those rings, we're able to understand not only how old that fish is and how big it is at that size, but also how big that fish was at a younger age. And that creates pretty powerful information for us to understand what the conditions in the fishery are that drive that.
All right, thank you, Matt. This next question here is for Andy. Andy, from 2011 to 2017, Fish and Game stocked over 35 million kokanee. Instead of suppressing predators even further, why not continue stocking kokanee?
Sure. So we certainly were stocking kokanee in that time period, and it was being done in conjunction with predator suppression. So that's a time period when we were actively suppressing the lake trout population, trying to reduce predation on kokanee. And at the same time, we were stocking kokanee in the lake to try to help recover that population and jumpstart it. So now it wouldn't make sense if we had just stocked kokanee in the early 2000s, for example, when lake trout were rapidly increasing, and not suppressed lake trout. We would have just been basically feeding those lake trout and not recovering kokanee. That's been done in many different cases without success. And so in this instance, we were coupling an aggressive stocking program with suppression of lake trout predation, and it was effective at accomplishing our goals.
All right, Andy, I've got another question for you here. Do Girard rainbows eat bull trout?
Yeah, I can't say they don't. I think there's potential they could. However, Girard rainbow trout and bull trout co-evolved, meaning that they are native in the same system. So if you go up to Kootenai Lake, for example, Girard rainbows are native to Kootenai Lake, as are bull trout, and those two species have lived in that lake, for forever and done well together. So if there is any level of predation on bull trout by Girards, it's at a low level and certainly not something that threatens the sustainability of a bull trout population. And then in addition, we've actually done diet work on rainbow trout. One study in particular I'm thinking of from the 1990s documented that kokanee make up the majority of the diet for at least Girards that are above about 16 inches. That's the primary food source for them. And I do not recall any bull trout being documented in any of those in that study. And so again, not to say it can't occur, but if it does, it appears to be at a very low level.
All right, Andy, I've got another question for you here. Could the introduction of certain shad species help with mysis shrimp and cause another food source that could help sustain, which could in turn help kokanee?
Yeah, that one's a tough one. And again, it gets back to, every time we add a non-native species in these systems, things get incredibly more complex. And so certainly adding something like a shad to the mix is something that we wouldn't do. There's just too many unknowns, too many risks there, more potential for bad outcomes than good outcomes.
All right, thank you, Andy. This next question is from Matt. Matt, do you know how many $1,000 tagged walleye have been donated to the food banks throughout the netting program?
I do not know exactly what that number is right now. It's a small number, a handful, but we don't donate them to the food banks. So our protocol for both lake trout and walleye on the net boat is we remove the heads on the net boat when we process those fish, and they go to the food bank headless, so that folks who are participating in the food bank program, none of those folks are able to turn in those heads for either a lake trout bounty or to win $1,000 prize from the walleye program. Yeah, and the other part of that is that we do replace the tags. So we're trying to maintain an at-large group of 100 fish that's in the system at any given time. And we're always plus or minus a few, but anytime we get our hands on walleye with an opportunity to bump it back up around that 100 fish level, we do that.
Okay, I'm just going to bring up a slide here real quick. Oh, there is. It looks like we have one more question rolling here. We're just about done with questions, but.
Yeah, Andy, one last question here. Someone just wanted to thank you all once again for the video and the meeting, and they recognize your hard work. But they did have a question as it related to where do Girard rainbows spawn?
Sure, I'm gonna let Ken answer that one because he's doing a lot of the tributary monitoring.
Yeah, so I do, my program does tributary monitoring around the lake. We've got 25 tributaries that we sample on a rotational basis. And for the most part, the majority of the Girard spawn in the Pack River watershed and up Lightning Creek watershed.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting just because we don't see Girards using places like Gold Creek, Granite Creek, and some of these other major tributary complexes where we see a lot of use by cutthroat and bull trout. So pretty interesting that these rainbows have these pretty strong preferences for certain drainages in the system, but not others. So I'm going to just put up a slide here. We've reached the end of the questions. They've been slowly, or they've been coming in more slowly, and I think we just finally hit an ending point here. And so we've been at this for close to 2 hours. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I just wanted to let folks know, for starters, we really appreciate your participation. I know a lot of you watched the presentation, which was certainly a long presentation. We try to provide a lot of information for folks. There's a lot going on the lake. As I mentioned in the presentation, it's a complex fishery, a lot of different elements to it. It's certainly very difficult to keep everybody happy with all those interests, but we're doing the best we can to provide a fishery that's functioning at a high level and providing a lot of diversity of opportunity. I think we're having a lot of that occur right now, and we hope that a lot of you are going to get out this year and participate in the fishery. We'll certainly be doing outreach throughout the year. I highlighted in the presentation some of the ways you can look for that outreach on our website. One thing in particular I wanted to remind you of, and on this slide here, you can see the web address that you can go to what we've now created as a Lake Pend Oreille Fisheries page on our Panhandle Regional page. So just go to that idfg.idaho.gov/LPO. And this will be the place where throughout the year we post anything that's Pend Oreille related. That'll be meeting announcements, it'll be news stories, it'll be when we put out telemetry maps to show you where we're finding walleye. If we have a video maybe that we put together that we want to post, basically all things related to Pend Oreille. So if you are really interested in the Pend Oreille fishery, just keep an eye on this website for new information that'll pop up periodically. I think we got to just about all the questions. I know some of the questions were kind of multi-part questions. If we happen to miss part of your question or miss your question altogether, we've been trying to read these as they come through, but feel free to reach out to us. We've provided our contact information. Any of us or other staff certainly available to talk about the fishery anytime you want. So we appreciate that kind of feedback and engagement. And again, thanks for your participation, and we hope to see you out on the water this year. And I think with that, we'll conclude the meeting, and I hope everyone has a good night.